Most people walk past him without a second thought. A silent man in a faded canvas jacket, just the mechanic with grease-stained gloves and a coffee mug that never left his side. They called him Walt, barely looking up when he passed. To them, he was background noise, part of the hangar like the oil drums and tool racks. But Sarah Blake saw something else. Something in the way his hands hovered just a moment longer over each aircraft, or how his eyes held the sky like he was still up there somewhere. She didn't know about the war or the friend he'd left behind. She didn't know the reason he hadn't flown in over 30 years. No one did. Until the storm came. Until a desperate radio call crackled through the base and every trained pilot was gone, grounded, or too afraid to answer. That's when Walt Ramsey, quiet, overlooked, forgotten, stood up, opened a locker no one had touched in decades, and walked straight into the blizzard. And in that moment, the base remembered. Not all heroes raise their voices. Some just fly. This is the story of the man they thought was just a mechanic, until the sky called him home. They used to call him just a mechanic, an old man with oil-soaked hands, a quiet presence who blended into the background like part of the hangar itself. Walter Ramsey had spent decades keeping the helicopters flying, though he never climbed into one himself. To the others, he was just Walt, always there, always silent, the one with a wrench who never asked for anything, never offered stories, and never tried to be noticed. But when the storm rolled down off the mountain and the final desperate call for help crackled over the radio, there was no one left. No pilot, no response team, just Walt. He didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to a forgotten locker buried in dust and time, pulled open its creaking door, and took out something no one knew was even his, a faded, weather-worn flight suit. He ran his hand over the fabric as if touching a piece of his former self. Without a word, he stepped into it, fastened each strap with quiet purpose, lifted a helmet from the shadows, and walked into the storm. And then, for the first time in decades, Walt's voice came over the comms, calm, firm, unmistakably seasoned. "This is Eagle 4. I'm lifting off." Every sound in the base stilled. Every face turned toward the runway. The sky, damaged in white, had become his again. The wind howled through Pine Ridge like a blade slashing across the land, tossing powdery snow in jagged gusts that danced under the dim, silvery light of an early Montana morning. The mountains stood off in the distance, tall and silent, their peaks blanketed in white like ancient watchers. It was December. And up here, time moved slower. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting. The base was tucked at the end of an old, forgotten logging road, guarded by rust-flecked chain-link fences rimmed with frost. Inside the sprawling metallic shell of Hangar 3, the scent of diesel and cold steel hung thick in the air. Rows of Blackhawks, dusted in snow, sat like sleeping beasts beneath high arches, motionless, but never idle. In the farthest, dimmest corner of the hangar, where light didn't reach and no one ever wandered, Walt worked alone. Always alone. He was 71 now. Too old, some said, to still be crawling under airframes and listening for the heartbeat of a machine. But he moved with a kind of grace that didn't age, precise, methodical. A faded brown canvas jacket clung to his wiry frame, and his thick gloves, blackened from years of labor, flexed with the muscle memory of a lifetime. A flashlight rested between his shoulder and chin as he leaned into the chopper's belly, his breath fogging the metal. He inspected every bolt as if it were a life on the line. Every creak, every whisper of resistance in the engine, every subtle tremor in the rotors. He felt it, heard it, long before any gauge could report it. It wasn't just knowledge, it was something deeper. The younger crew barely noticed him most days. They called him Walt, or sometimes just the wrench. A few gave a casual nod, fewer still said thanks. None asked where he was from, and not one of them knew what he used to be. To them, he was simply part of the hangar. Quiet, predictable, permanent. This morning they clustered near the break table, mugs of coffee steaming in gloved hands, their chatter floating under the static of the radio and the clatter of tools. "Ever seen Walt fly?" one of them asked, voice wrapped in sarcasm. "Fly?" another laughed. "He just fixes them. Probably never touched a stick. He's like the coffee maker, always there." They weren't unkind, just young, 20-somethings in clean flight suits, energy buzzing with adrenaline and ambition. They traded tales of past rescues and tough extractions, the kind of stories they thought would make them legends one day. They were always hunting the next big mission, the next opportunity to prove themselves. Walt didn't join them. He never had. Instead, he stood beside Eagle 4, the old Black Hawk tucked deeper into the shadows than the others. He ran his fingers along a shallow gouge in the tail boom, tracing it like an old wound. That helicopter was always pristine, fueled, tuned, ready. No one else touched it. No one questioned why he kept it that way. Most assumed it was just another of his routines. Old guys get like that. But Sarah Blake had started to wonder. One of the youngest pilots on rotation, Sarah often found herself watching him when she thought no one would notice. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way he worked, how he paused before tightening a bolt, like he was hearing something no one else could, or how his eyes sometimes lingered on the open sky a moment too long, like it was calling to him. She didn't know his story, but there was something in his silence that commanded respect, something that made her quiet too. Outside, the weather had begun to shift. The snow no longer danced. It struck hard sideways, thick and fast. The kind of storm that didn't just arrive, it took over. No one said it out loud, but the sky was changing, and Walt felt it before anyone else. A wrench dropped somewhere nearby, the clang echoing off the metal walls. Heads turned, but Walt didn't flinch. His hand stayed steady on the cold frame of Eagle 4. His mind, however, drifted. Unbidden, it went back, far away, far back, to heat, to thunder, to rotor blades slicing jungle air thick with smoke and screams. Vietnam. He had never spoken of it. Not once in the 2 decades he'd worked the line at Pine Ridge Air Base. And yet, in moments like this, it was there, burning beneath his skin, alive in the noise of a coming storm. Sometimes on nights when the hangar lights dimmed to a low hum and the snow outside muffled the world into a kind of sacred stillness, the memories crept back in. They came uninvited but relentless. Walt could still feel the bite of sweat beneath his helmet, the oppressive weight of the jungle heat pressing down as rotor blades screamed overhead. That mission, one he'd never forget, had been a medevac deep in the tree line, where the radio signals dissolved into static and the jungle floor seemed to inhale and exhale like a living thing. Their call sign was Dust Off 6. Walt had been the last one in the air that night. A team was pinned down with no way out except up. They'd pushed in under fire, the helicopter rattling as it took hits on approach. They got the wounded on board. That's when everything changed. Reed, his co-pilot, only 25, bright, sharp, the kind of guy who could make you laugh even in hell, always had Johnny Cash humming through the headset. A shell exploded near the tail. The bird jerked violently. Walt wrestled the controls, managing to keep the aircraft level just long enough to clear the ridge. Then came the smoke, the scream in his headset, and the silence that followed. Reed didn't make it back. The brass called it heroism. They pinned medals to his chest, Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 commendations. But Walt never wore them. What no one saw, what no medal could ever recognize, was the way he had dragged himself from the wreckage with one arm broken, lungs scorched with smoke, and a heart cracked open under the weight of loss. Reed wasn't just a co-pilot, he was like a brother, and Walt had brought him home in pieces. When he returned to the States, Walt didn't step back into a cockpit, not because he couldn't, but because he believed he no longer deserved to. Instead, he turned wrenches. He fixed what others couldn't. That became his way of making amends, staying close to the birds without ever taking to the sky again. Sarah Blake never knew the full story, but she felt its outline in the quiet, in the way Walt's eyes lost focus when certain static drifted across the radio, in the brief hesitation of his hands when younger pilots recounted near misses with casual pride. Once she'd seen an old photograph tucked behind the tools in his locker, faded, water-damaged, but still warm somehow. 2 young men, arms draped over each other's shoulders, grinning like they were untouchable. She didn't ask, Walt didn't explain, but in the silence she understood. He wasn't grounded by age, he was grounded by ghosts. The storm began with a whisper on the radio. Possible squall forming north of the Sawtooth. Winds picking up. At first, no one paid it much mind. Montana in December was a roulette wheel of storms. Just another busted fuel line in the day. But Walt froze. Torque a wrench mid-turn. His eyes narrowed toward the hangar doors. Something about the way the snow moved. It wasn't falling now. It was slashing sideways, fast and angry, scraping the windows like sand on glass. Clouds dropped lower, dragging over the peaks like a living beast. Walt had flown through skies like that before. He knew what they were saying, and he didn't like it. Across the hangar, Sarah stood at the radio console, headset over one ear, brow furrowed deep. "Eagle 2, repeat that?" she said, voice taut. The reply came through static, broken but urgent. "Visibility's gone. Winds tossing us sideways. Can't see the ridgeline. We need evac." Another burst of static. "Repeat. We are grounded. Transmitting coordinates now." Walt's stomach sank. He was already moving toward her as she pressed her palm against the speaker, straining to hold on to the fading message. "It's Chris," she said, turning to him, eyes wide. "Commander Hammond's team. They were mid-medevac when the storm turned. Got the injured hiker on board, but now they're stuck near Granite Hollow. Iced in bad." "Who's left to fly?" Walt asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah's eyes flicked around the hangar. The other aircraft were all grounded. Maintenance, ice damage, or out on missions. Only one was left. Eagle 4. The same bird Walt had meticulously cared for, alone. No one else had touched it in years. Most of the pilots were out, running fire watch, cargo drops, or still on training routes south of Missoula. The few who had returned were either running on fumes or still being debriefed. And the storm, it wasn't waiting. It was closing in, fast and without mercy. Sarah's voice cut through the tense quiet, her hand hovering over the dial as if bracing for news she already feared. "Dispatch is trying to reroute someone from Cascade," she said, voice tight with strain. "But they're over an hour out. No air support anywhere close." The hangar, once filled with the low hum of maintenance and chatter, now felt hollow. Cold seeped into the silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Until finally, one voice broke the stillness with the truth they had all been avoiding. "There's no one left who can reach them in time." Instinctively, every eye turned to Walt. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply stared out through the frost-covered windows as if he could see something the rest of them couldn't. The sky had turned a bruised shade of gray. The wind screamed against the hangar walls like a wounded animal, and the snow danced violently across the runway in relentless spirals. It wasn't just a storm, it was a warning. This kind of weather didn't offer second chances. It punished hesitation. Only someone who had looked it in the eye and lived to tell the tale could make it through. Sarah's voice lowered to a whisper. "Walt, Eagle 4 is ready, right?" He gave a short, firm nod. She looked at him then, really looked. For the first time since she'd met him, she didn't just see the aging mechanic with oil-stained hands. She saw something deeper. A man carved by battles no one had ever spoken of. A man who bore the silence of survivors. The kind who didn't need to tell stories because they carried them in their eyes. In that moment, she understood. Walt wasn't just their best chance. He was their only one. Outside, the wind howled louder. The radio spit static. Sarah leaned over the console, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the frequency. "Eagle 2, do you copy? Hang in there. We're doing everything we can." A crackle. Then a broken voice pushed through the noise. "Losing heat? Whiteout? Can't hold." Then silence. Sarah looked across the hangar. No one spoke now. The tough exteriors had faded. The bravado stripped bare. Every face wore the same look. Helplessness. There was no backup. No miracle pilot flying in from across the ridge. All that remained was a storm, and one man who hadn't flown in years. Walt stood beside Eagle 4, the bird he'd tuned with devotion, not just as a mechanic but like a guardian. His hands hung at his sides, fingers loose but ready. His jaw was locked, and behind his eyes something churned. A storm older than the one outside. Sarah moved toward him, slowly, as if any sound might shatter the weight in the air. "Walt." Her voice wavered. She hesitated, then said what had to be said. You're the only one who can. He didn't answer, didn't blink, just kept staring into the snow. She didn't press. She didn't have to. The silence between them held something bigger than words. Understanding, respect, fear, and something close to faith. After a long breath, Walt exhaled. Then, wordless, he turned toward the side of the hangar, to a locker long forgotten by everyone but him. The old latch gave a hard metallic click, echoing through the stillness like a thunderclap. Inside, untouched for years, was a faded green flight suit, the fabric softened by time, the patch on the chest barely legible. Ramsey. Below it, a helmet, scratched but whole. The straps still looped the same way he'd left them all those years ago. Walt reached in and lifted the flight suit like it was something sacred. He didn't rush. He peeled off his work jacket and boots, folding them with quiet reverence. He stepped into the suit, every motion deliberate. He zipped the front, fastened the collar, tightened the cuffs. Then he picked up the helmet and paused, just held it. For a moment, the hangar was utterly still. Then he placed it on, the straps snapping shut beneath his chin, like a whisper from a life he hadn't meant to return to. Sarah watched, her breath stuck in her throat. Walt walked to Eagle 4 and laid a hand on the rotor's edge. Not like a mechanic checking parts, but like a man greeting an old comrade. There was something sacred in it, something final. He climbed into the cockpit. Fingers moved with a rhythm his body hadn't forgotten. Panels came alive. Switches flipped. The engines growled, then settled into a hum that felt almost eager. The helicopter lit up beneath him, responding like it had simply been waiting. For him. Sarah approached, eyes wide. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice unsteady. Walt looked up at her from beneath the visor. His eyes didn't waver. He didn't say yes. He didn't have to. Everything in his silence said what they all now knew. No one else could. The rotors began to turn, slicing through the wind as the storm raged on, unforgiving but no longer unanswered. Snow slashed across the windshield in furious, diagonal streaks, like silk being torn by invisible knives. The storm raged outside with a relentless howl, shrinking the world into a blur of blinding white. Beyond the cockpit glass, nothing existed. Only chaos, only cold. But inside, Walt Ramsey sat motionless, calm as the eye of the storm. His grip on the controls was steady, his breathing slow and measured, like he'd never left the seat at all. It had been over 3 decades since he last flew, since his hands had guided a bird through the sky, 30 years, since the thrum of the rotors hummed through his bones like a second heartbeat. But the second the skids lifted from the tarmac, something ancient had stirred inside him. Something primal. Not thought, not training. Deeper. Muscle memory. Instinct. That unspoken bond only aviators understood. As the earth fell away and the helicopter surged into the blizzard, it felt less like flight and more like resurrection. Walt didn't bother looking out the canopy. There was nothing to see but white rage. Instead, his eyes stayed locked on the instruments. Artificial horizon, altimeter, a navigation panel blinking and sputtering under interference. Out there was a maelstrom, but in here, the small capsule of control, it was different. The skies may have changed, but Walt hadn't. "Come on, girl," he said softly, barely more than a breath, brushing his hand across the dash like it was something alive, like it could feel him. One more time. Sheets of snow slammed against the canopy, and ice clawed hungrily at the rotors. The wind jerked the helicopter left, then yanked it harder right. But Walt didn't fight it with brute force. He guided the aircraft with practiced ease, coaxing it back on course like a man leading a spooked horse through unfamiliar woods. Then his voice dropped to something more intimate, quieter than before. Not to the chopper now, but to a memory. "Reed, you'd laugh your ass off if you saw this," he thought, a wistful half-smile on his face. "You'd say I was out of my mind." He swallowed hard. "But you'd understand. You'd know why I had to do it." The headset gave nothing back, just static. No voices, no confirmation. Only the constant drone of the engines and the storm's angry scream against the fuselage. Still, Walt kept going, his gaze flicking between dials and the storm-thick void beyond. GPS was nearly useless in this weather. Coordinates meant little when the sky was a soup of snow and wind. Radio signals could only go so far in a world drowned in static and white noise. But Walt didn't need flawless tech. He had something better. He had feel. He nudged the stick gently, adjusting a few degrees north, tapping his fingers absently against the throttle. Granite Hollow, he'd muttered to himself. East-facing ridge, low elevation. That's where I'd go. If I had wounded on board, I'd look for cover, somewhere shielded. He dropped altitude in cautious stages, reading the subtle shift in cabin pressure, the squeeze in his chest that told him he was getting lower. Through the gaps in the snowfall, the shapes of treetops began to materialize. Dark smudges below, ghost-like and shifting through the snow veil. His visor fogged with each breath, but he didn't bother wiping it clear. His eyes never stopped, moving, scanning, searching. Then, there, just a blink, a metallic glint breaking through the monochrome storm. Walt circled back, careful, calculating. There you are, he said, voice tightening with focus. Half buried in a snowbank, tail twisted up like a broken spine, was the downed rescue chopper. One rotor blade was buried in the drift. It looked like a frozen carcass. But beside it, a flicker of movement. A human form, arms raised, waving frantically. Walt clenched his jaw, the lines in his face cutting deep. This is it. He eased the helicopter around into position, angled the pitch, and began his descent. Slow, deliberate, every adjustment a battle against the storm's fury. The bird groaned under the strain, metal and wind in fierce argument. But Walt whispered to her again, voice almost loving. Easy now. Just hold it together. Not much farther. And then, with a heavy jolt that rattled his bones, the skids touched down. Not soft, but solid. Enough. He exhaled, long and steady, the kind of breath that carried 30 years of silence with it. He had found them. Not through screens, not through coordinates or computers, but through something far older. A compass storms couldn't shake. A promise storms couldn't erase. The wind screamed louder now, furious at being defied. Snow curled in savage spirals across the windshield, erasing everything but silhouettes. Broken trees, the twisted hull of the fallen bird, and vague figures moving in the haze. Walt tightened his grip on the controls, keeping the chopper level against the gale's wild bucking. He reached for the radio, flipped the switch, and spoke with calm authority. This is Eagle 4, grounded near Granite Hollow. Do you read? Silence, just static. Then, Walt, is that you? A voice, thin, cracked, but unmistakably human. Walt closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him like the ocean meeting shore. I'm here, he said. I've got you. The side door slid open and the storm came pouring in, cold, fierce, alive. But through the curtain of snow, more shapes emerged. They were no longer just shadows now. They were people. Bundled figures staggered toward the chopper, silhouettes hunched against the punishing wind, arms raised to shield their eyes from the biting snow. One man limped badly, every step a battle, flanked on either side by two comrades who gripped him tight, refusing to let him fall. Flashlights cut through the whiteout, slicing through the darkness, bouncing light off the frozen metal skin of the waiting aircraft. Walt had stepped out of the cockpit just long enough to catch the first man as he stumbled toward the open hatch. The injured man was heavy, dead weight, but Walt didn't flinch. Muscles burned as he hauled the man in, breath steaming from exertion, but his grip was steady. One of the crew scrambled aboard after, soaked to the bone and trembling from the cold. Then came the final figure, slower, more deliberate. Commander Chris Hammond. His steps were shaky, uncertain. He reached up and pulled back his hood, revealing a gash above his temple. Blood matted into his hair. His eyes were wide, not from the injury, but from something else. Recognition. Disbelief. He stared at Walt as though he had seen a ghost. You, Hammond rasped, voice catching in his throat. I didn't think. No time for that. Walt cut in, calm, unmoved, his voice solid as steel. Get in. Hammond hesitated just for a moment. Then he gave a sharp nod, helped secure the remaining injured, and climbed aboard. The hatch slammed shut behind him with a metallic thud. Inside, chaos reigned. Cold bodies leaned against one another for warmth, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. Loose straps and buckles rattled with the turbulence. Walt slipped back into the pilot's seat, hands already moving with practiced ease, pulling the harness over his chest. Outside, the storm had grown vicious. Snow streaked sideways in thick waves, more static than snowfall now. The wind pounded the helicopter's frame, shrieking against the metal like fists on a locked door. Warning lights blinked angrily on the dash. Vibrations groaned under his fingertips, every signal screaming the same word: don't. But Walt Ramsey didn't hesitate. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, locked on the horizon or what little of it he could make out through the storm. Not this time. Not again. This time he wasn't leaving anyone behind. His fingers flew across the controls, adjusting, correcting, coaxing life from the chopper like an old friend. The rotors whined and then roared. Chunks of ice shattered from the blades as they spun faster, slicing through the storm with mounting fury. The aircraft trembled violently, protesting every inch of lift. Then, suddenly, it rose, cutting up through the snow like a phoenix clawing free from its icy grave. The treetops fell away beneath them. The wind howled and clawed, trying to drag them back down, but Walt fought it like a man possessed. He tilted hard into the gusts, adjusting pitch and yaw with precision so exact it looked like instinct. His movements were fluid, graceful, decades of knowledge coming alive in a cockpit he never truly left behind. Inside, Hammond watched in silence. The blood on his face had dried, but his eyes hadn't moved from Walt. This was no mechanic, not just a mechanic. This was a man born of the ski, reclaiming it without a word. He wasn't flying the chopper, he was commanding it. And as the mountain disappeared behind them, swallowed once more by the swirling curtain of snow, a truth settled into every soul on board. They were still alive, because Walt Ramsey had come for them. And this time he hadn't left anyone behind. The storm hadn't let up, not fully, but the snow thinned just enough to reveal the landing pad through the haze. Its lights blinked beneath a coat of frost, faint flickering beacons calling them home. The rotors beat against the silence, echoing across the compound as the helicopter descended. Walt guided it down slowly, cautiously, until the skids touched the frozen surface with a soft thump, like a battle-worn eagle finally returning to its nest. He powered down in the engine and the rotor slowed with a long, groaning sigh. The moment the blades stilled, a strange hush settled across the hangar grounds. At first, no one moved. Then, as if pulled by some invisible force, figures emerged from the warmth of the base. Mechanics, technicians, kitchen staff, even off-duty pilots in hastily thrown-on jackets. They stood motionless in the snow, eyes fixed on the chopper. The side doors creaked open. One by one, the rescue team stepped down into the light, exhausted, bruised, alive. Commander Hammond was the last to exit. He took each step carefully, his breath visible in the cold. When he reached the bottom, he turned and offered his hand to Walt. But Walt didn't need help. He climbed out with slow, deliberate motion. Helmet tucked under one arm, snow landing lightly on his shoulders. He stood straight, silent. The storm behind him, the warmth of the base before him. No one said a word, no jokes, no jeers. No one called out, "Hey, Walt, grab a wrench." The silence wasn't awkward, it was reverent, because this wasn't about medals or rank. It wasn't about titles. It was about the kind of courage that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that waits quietly in the shadows until the world has no other choice but to call upon it. Through the stillness, Sarah Blake pushed forward from the crowd. Her eyes were shimmering with emotion. She stopped in front of Walt, barely able to speak. "You saved them," she whispered, voice trembling. "You saved all of them." Walt gave a small nod. It wasn't pride, it was reflex, muscle memory. She shook her head, her disbelief plain. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Before Walt could respond, Commander Hammond stepped up beside her, snow streaked across his coat, his eyes still on the man who had just pulled them from the jaws of the storm. Walt's brow furrowed slightly, his lips still parted as if reaching for words that wouldn't come. "We thought you were just a mechanic," someone said quietly. Walt didn't flinch, he didn't smile, didn't scowl. His face stayed as calm and steady as his eyes, clear, unreadable, grounded. For a long beat, no one moved. Then he finally answered, his voice low and sure. Some things are easier shown than said. His words lingered, suspended in the crisp, cold air like frost. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Sarah dropped her gaze, something tightening in her chest. A weight, quiet but real. Around them, the crew stood still, and although no one spoke, something subtle had shifted. The confusion in their eyes had melted away. The casual dismissiveness that had once followed Walt like a shadow was gone. Now, when they looked at him, it was as if they were truly seeing him for the very first time. Inside the hangar, golden light cast soft pools across the floor. From somewhere near the ready room, the familiar scent of coffee drifted out, normalcy returning in gentle waves. But in that ordinary moment, something intangible had changed. Respect doesn't always arrive with clapping hands or blaring horns. Sometimes it's in the way people instinctively make space when you walk past. Sometimes it's found in the hush that falls over a group too moved to risk breaking a sacred silence with clumsy words. Walt didn't linger for recognition. He turned and walked back into the hangar, toward the warmth and routine of the place that had once overlooked him. But now every eye followed, and no one ever again would call him just a mechanic. The storm passed in the night. Morning arrived crisp and clear. The sky, a flawless blue, stretched over a base blanketed in snow. The air bit sharply, the kind of cold that demands your attention but also commands a certain respect. In Hangar 3, life resumed. Metal clanged, low conversations buzzed in the corners. The rhythm of work had returned, but not untouched. Something beneath the surface was different. Walt Ramsey was already there, dressed as always in his worn flannel shirt and solid boots. He moved slowly, deliberately, wiping down his tools and inspecting the hydraulic lines on the Eagle. On the surface, it was as if nothing had changed, but it had. Not in him, but in them. In the way people shifted as he passed, in the pause of conversations, in the quiet, unconscious straightening of younger mechanics when he entered the room. The nickname, the wrench, had vanished, no longer spoken, no longer needed. They didn't need to label him anymore. They knew. Even the air inside the hangar felt heavier, like it too remembered what had happened. Sarah Blake approached, a clipboard tucked beneath her arm, a paper cup of coffee in her hand. She didn't speak, just offered him the coffee. Walt took it wordlessly, gave her a faint, grateful smile. Nothing else needed to be said. That afternoon, a courier from the commander's office arrived with a sealed envelope. It carried the weight of something rare. Inside was a formal letter of commendation, not the kind handed out by default. This one held meaning, recognition for valor and composure in flight under extreme conditions, for saving 4 lives, for stepping forward when no one else could. Walt read the letter once. Then gently he folded it, like something sacred. He didn't put it in the front office, didn't brag or show it off in the ready room. Instead, he made his way to his workbench, past shelves lined with tools, past the racks worn smooth from years of use. Above the hook where he kept his trusted wrench, there had always been a bare patch of wall, plain, unnoticed. That's where he pinned the letter. Not for applause, not for pride, for memory, for Reed, for the ones who didn't make it home, for the flight suits that still haunted his thoughts, for the silent vow he made in the snow all those years ago. That evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon, stretching golden shadows across the hangar floor, Walt remained behind. The base had returned to its rhythm, but he lingered at his bench, cleaning tools that were already spotless. Not because the job demanded it, but because this quiet, solitary work still grounded him. Legacy isn't always marked with medals or grand farewells. Sometimes it's the tool you pass down, the nod you receive without a word, the way a room adjusts, not because you asked, but because now they see. Walt Ramsey never needed applause. He just needed to be remembered. And now, finally, he was. As the last rays of sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, a soft golden light spilled through the hangar doors, quiet and warm, like a promise kept. Light poured across the mountain peaks, stretching long shadows over the untouched snowfields that wrapped around Painridge Air Base. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world stripped bare, crisp, quiet, as though even the earth had taken a deep breath and held it. Walt Ramsey stood motionless just outside the hangar, a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand, the other resting in the deep pocket of his well-worn canvas coat. The cold clung to the air, but it didn't seem to register with him. His gaze wandered to the horizon, to the very mountains he had flown over the previous night. Now they stood blanketed in a serene sheet of fresh snow, undisturbed, like the chaos of the storm had never dared touch them. Above the ridgeline, two hawks traced lazy circles in the sky, unhurried and calm. The wind had stilled, yet its presence lingered. Walt could still feel it deep in his bones, like a ghost that never truly left. "Some storm," he murmured, barely louder than a breath. "You fly into." His voice hung in the air, fragile and thoughtful. "Some you fly through." Then he paused, and a subtle smile crept onto his face, small but knowing. "And some are inside." A breeze stirred, gentle now, no longer wild and biting like before. He didn't flinch. It no longer roared within him. Not anymore. He remembered the faces. He always would. Reed's laugh, the voices on the radio as chaos unfolded, the searing heat, the suffocating smoke. Those memories used to be sharp, like shards of glass buried in his chest. But time had softened them, made them feel like old photographs tucked into the corners of his mind. Edges dulled, colors faded, but still impossibly vivid in their own quiet way. Not enough to wound him now, but never far enough to forget. Walt lifted his cup gently, as though toasting the sky, or maybe to the ones he carried with him. Behind him, the hangar buzzed softly with life. Young mechanics joked and exchanged tools. The static crackle of radios spilled out weather updates, and Sarah Blake's calm voice read flight logs with steady focus. No one intruded on Walt's moment. They didn't need to. But a few glanced his way, just briefly, with something close to reverence. He turned slowly, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and made his way back toward the hangar. The weight he had carried all these years hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It no longer pulled at him like an anchor. It walked beside him now, less a burden, more a quiet companion. Some legacies aren't forged through grand speeches or loud victories. Some are etched in silence, in the choices made without witness, in the strength shown when no one is watching. What we choose to carry, and how we carry it, often says more than any words ever could. The morning sun cast a golden hue across the sky, bathing the mountains in amber stillness. Walt Ramsey stepped back into the hangar's glow. Not just a mechanic, not only a pilot, but a man who had made peace with all the storms, inside and out. His story holds something quietly powerful. Not every hero wears a medal. Not every kind of strength needs a spotlight. In a world that often prizes volume over value, we too often overlook the quiet ones, the ones who bear their scars without complaint, who show up when it matters, who never ask for recognition but deserve it most. How many Walt Ramseys do we pass without ever knowing their stories? A veteran quietly standing in line at the store, a retired teacher patching a neighbor's roof without asking for thanks, an old man in a small-town workshop who once held the lives of others in his calloused hands. In today's rush toward everything new, it's easy to forget the depth that age brings. But stories like Walt's remind us, courage doesn't fade. Wisdom doesn't wither. Dignity doesn't age. It deepens. Walt didn't fly that mission for glory. He did it because when the time came, he knew someone had to, and he could. And that, to him, was reason enough. So, what storms are you facing in your life? Are you listening to the quiet voices? Are you honoring those who carry their battles silently with grace? If you've ever known someone like Walt, someone who surprised you with their quiet heroism, we'd love to hear about them. What legacy will you leave behind? Tell us your story in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. And if this touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We'll keep sharing stories that shine a light on the silent strength, the quiet kindness, and the powerful grace hidden all around us. Because sometimes the ones who say the least are the ones who've lived through the most.